Let's talk about some of your answers for the Is Google Making Us Stupid questions. Keep in mind that your first essay test will cover this article, and the essay does texting affect writing or some combination of both articles. Let's take a look at the first question I asked you. What is Carr's hook? Why is it effective? And what is Carr's main argument? So what I'm going to do to try to keep this video relatively brief is pull out a specific quotation from the text. You'll notice that the quote is dropped. I'm not integrating the quote or citing the quote or writing analysis here. I'm just pulling out some of the quotes so that you can go to your own text and maybe highlight or pull out those quotations as well. So Carr references this scene from 2001, A Space Odyssey, this really famous and trippy, bizarre, but wonderful movie by Stanley Kubrick, in which the supercomputer, in one scene at least, is someone that we kind of sympathize with. And the astronaut who is trying to unplug or kill the supercomputer seems to be acting in this very cold, mechanical way. And he almost seems like the robot or like the machine. So Nicholas Carr uses this as a hook and says that he feels kind of like that supercomputer that he's being unplugged. The supercomputer in 2001 is called HAL. Now, if you've seen this movie, then you'll understand how powerful the scene is. If you haven't, there's a link in the page in the module where you can see a clip or the clip that's being referenced here. And Nicholas Carr's central argument is that something, and he's arguing that it's the internet and in particular Google, is changing the way that he thinks and chipping away at his ability to concentrate. Let's take a look at number 2. What imagery does Carr supply to describe the experience of being on the web and give specific examples? So there's actually lots of imagery in this piece. This piece is pretty famous because so many people had strong reactions to it or found themselves nodding along or maybe even found themselves replicating exactly what it is that he's talking about, how it's really hard to focus on a long or longish article, especially when you're reading online. Some people find that the article is a great case in point, or reading the article is a great case in point. So there's lots of figurative language and lots of imagery, even though this is an article and not, say, a short story or a novel. Here's just one example. Carr says, "Now I'm as likely as not to be foraging in the web's info thickets, reading emails, writing emails, scanning headlines and blog posts, watching videos and listening to podcasts, or just tripping from link to link to link." So I want to unpack the word forage and thicket. To forage means to search for some sort of food. Maybe you're foraging in the forest for nuts and berries or meat. And a thicket is some sort of heavily wooded area. Think of a wilderness area. I think this comparison, this image actually makes a lot of sense here because when we are searching for something online using Google or just searching through your course shells on Canvas, it is almost like you're searching in the wilderness or in a really dense thicket because there's so much information. You have to sort through or sift through all sorts of useless information or interesting but non-applicable information to try to find what it is that you're looking for. So there's a lot that you have to filter out until you can find that berry, until you can find that article or that answer to the question that you are looking for. So think foraging and thicket. Those words are really interesting here. Then the second one, my mind now expects to take in information the way the net distributes it in a swiftly moving stream of particles. Once I was a scuba diver in a sea of words, now I zip along the surface like a guy on a jet ski. So what I really like about this image is we can see sort of vertical vertical reading versus horizontal reading. So he compares himself to a scuba diver, or he used to be like a scuba diver, who close reads a text, who analyzes a text, who goes deep into the text and tries to understand it. Think about what scuba diving entails. You have to have a lot of prep, you have to know what you're doing, you have to have some training, and when you scuba dive, you might not cross lots of territory. You might not go for miles and miles, but you're really focused on maybe one coral reef or looking at one school of fish, right? You're looking at just a couple of things in really great detail. You're going way beneath the surface, right? When you jet ski, sounds like a lot of fun. I've never done it myself, but you might be going for a pretty big distance, but you're just skimming the surface, right? And also when you're on a jet ski, you're not really examining things. Things rush past you really quickly. You have water in your face. You're more in it for the thrill or getting from point A to point B. So it's kind of the opposite of scuba diving, right? Where you're really going in deep and trying to understand something and enter this new world. When you're jet skiing, you're not even really in the water, right? You're just skimming on the surface. So as silly as this comparison is, I think it's really apt here. These aren't the only answers, right? There's plenty of other imagery and figurative language that you could have brought up. Number 3, how can we connect the experiment from last week, that experiment that I asked you to do where you wrote a message of greeting to a friend on paper and then texted a message of greeting to that same friend, and to see if there were any differences in terms of capitalization or abbreviation or spelling or emojis. How can we connect that to Carr's text? And I think looking at what Nicholas Carr says about the philosopher Nietzsche's typewriter can help us understand that experiment. So what he says about Nietzsche is this, and actually he's quoting what somebody else has written about Nietzsche. The typewriter rescued him for a time. Once he had mastered touch typing, he was able to write with his eyes closed, using only the tips of his fingers. Words could once again flow from his mind to the page. But the machine had a subtler effect on his work. One of Nietzsche's friends, a composer, noticed a change in his style of writing. His already terse, or really to the point and concise prose, had become even tighter, more telegraphic. Perhaps you will, through this instrument, even take to a new idiom or language, the friend wrote in a letter, noting that in his own work, his thoughts and music and language often depend on the quality of pen and paper. You're right, Nietzsche replied. Our writing equipment takes part in the forming of our thoughts. Under the sway of the machine, writes the German media scholar Friedrich Kittler, Nietzsche's prose changed from arguments to aphorisms, from thoughts to puns, and from rhetoric to telegram style. I think this is really powerful, but it can seem a little bit intimidating at first. So an argument, that kind of speaks for itself, but an aphorism is a really short saying that conveys some sort of universal truth. So really short and powerful saying. And rhetoric is just the art of persuasion. So Nietzsche's arguments changed from being maybe more elaborate, even though with Nietzsche they were never incredibly like florid, to being shorter, even more to the point. From being a thought that might have been a couple sentences to a quick pun. So not only did the style change, but the way that he conceived of things, that changed as well. This comment right here, that his thoughts and music and language often depend on the quality of pen and paper, that kind of takes me back to earlier in the semester when we read that piece, that letter about how to write a letter, in which Garrison Keillor teaches us through his example how to write a letter. And he talks about how pen and paper and what you choose to write on, whether it's a postcard or your computer or an envelope or just a piece of notebook paper, can actually change the quality of your thoughts or what you choose to write about. That kind of reminded me of that moment here. So it's not just that the typewriter changed Nietzsche's writing style, but it actually changed a little bit his thought process, at least according to Nicholas Carr here. And we might think about how maybe the text message you found was a little bit different than what you wrote down on paper. Some of you in the discussion from last week actually said that there was no difference. Some of you said that there were a few differences. Maybe you used some emojis in the text message, but you did not draw pictures on paper. A lot of you mentioned that you used your friend's name on paper, but you did not use your friend's name when you were sending the text message. So it seems like a lot of you noticed really subtle changes. There were very few people, at least in this class, who noticed really dramatic changes, not just to the style, but also to the content. Let's look at number 4. Should schools teach students to power browse, or should teachers focus on developing students' deep reading skills? So in order to tell me your opinion, you first have to understand what Nicholas Carr means by power browse and deep reading. So power browse means to go through the text or whatever it is that you're reading, not just skimming, right? You're not just skimming over the surface, but you're looking for crucial bits of information that you can then go back to later. So it's kind of like a more skilled version of skimming. It might be something that you do when you're doing preliminary research for a research paper, or where you're asked to read an assignment, but you have a time constraint. Deep reading is something you do where you unpack the text, right? You deep read stanzas of poems or particular lines of a short story that have figurative language or that are especially rich. I would say you can't deep read everything, right? You can't close read and unpack every single thing that you're asked to read in an English class or in any other class. In my opinion, you need a little bit of both. You need to learn some power browsing skills, because if you are attempting to write a research paper, but you deep read every single book or source on the topic that you're writing about, it's going to take you 20 years to finish that research paper. So in my opinion, you have to learn how to power browse in combination with deep reading. But you have to know where to deep read. You have to know where to spend your time really pulling apart the text and looking for figurative languages and references to other texts and other authors, and where deep reading isn't going to result in that much. The same way if you're scuba diving, you probably don't want to scuba dive in any old place. You probably want to go somewhere where there's something interesting to see, or where there's some sort of variety, or some sort of rich ecosystem that you're trying to see. So in my opinion, you need a little bit of both. I'm curious what you think. According to Carr and Wolf, there are differences between reading and speech. And I should say this is pretty controversial. So reading, explains Wolf, again, this is Carr citing Wolf here, is not an instinctive skill for human beings. It's not etched into our genes the way speech is. We have to teach our minds how to translate the symbolic characters we see into language we understand. And the media or other technologies we use in learning and practicing the craft of reading play an important part in shaping the neural circuits inside our brains. Experiments demonstrate that readers of ideograms, such as Chinese, develop a mental circuitry for reading that is very different from the circuitry found in those of us whose written language employs an alphabet, like English or Spanish. The variations extend across many regions of the brain, including those that govern such essential cognitive functions as memory and the interpretation of visual and auditory stimuli. We can expect as well that the circuits woven by our use of the net will be different from those woven by our reading of books or other printed works. So let's unpack that a little bit. Let's explain what's going on. So an ideogram is some sort of symbol that represents an idea or a thought or even a word, whereas the alphabet or a word using the alphabet represents sounds, right? Those different letters that we have that make up a word, well, those different letters or letters grouped together make up sounds rather than ideas or symbols. So languages like Chinese or languages like Japanese are ideograms, whereas languages that use an alphabet, things like English, Spanish, French, those are examples of languages that use an alphabet. So the argument here is that people who learn ideograms first have different hookups in their brains. So the actual mental circuitry in their brains is different from people who learn using the alphabet. And he kind of takes the argument a little bit further. He says, if that is the case, if we have different mental hookups in our brains, it's not that one's better than the other, but if we have different mental hookups in our brains because of the types of language that we learn, then it follows, or we expect that if someone grows up using just the internet, or even if we adapt to using just the internet and not reading print books, if we grow up learning how to power browse or skim the net or go from link to link, it follows that the hookups in our brains will also be different, right? So someone who never uses the internet, who only reads on paper versus someone who uses the internet a lot or maybe even just a little, but those hookups will be different. The neural circuitry will be different. I should say again, this is a very controversial point, but I think it's an interesting one. I'd like to know your opinion on this if you think that has any value. And obviously part of this has yet to be determined, or is yet to be determined. A lot of this has to do with neuroscience information that we don't have access to right here, although I encourage you to do more research on it. But I'd like to know what you think about the argument, or just if in your own personal experience you believe that that's true. Let's look at number 6, discuss communication technologies that have changed the way you think. So this is just a personal question that I'm asking you to reflect on after you read Is Google Making Us Stupid? So you might think about something like Twitter. Twitter, as far as I know, I don't have Twitter, has character limits. There's the whole concept of retweeting, something that you tweet might be retweeted. Is that in the back of your mind when you tweet something? I've also heard that some websites will even have a delay in the load time to build anticipation, to make people a little bit more excited or more eager when they log in because they have to wait for a millisecond. So does something like Twitter change how you communicate? Think about texting. So depending on how you text, there might be a cost to texting, right? A financial cost. You're paying for that text message. Think about bubbles and what the bubbles represent. Do you have long blocks of text, or do you do lots of back and forth when you're texting? Think about ellipses. When you text someone, at least with the iPhone, and you can see that they're texting you back because you see those ... and sometimes they go away and they come back again. Does that change how we communicate with other people when you know that they're responding to you in real time? Think about Instagram. When we communicate with images or with text or with both on Instagram, are we viewing ourselves differently? Are we thinking of ourselves as performers? Are we thinking about communicating not just with words, but with images or facial expressions or filters? Think about email. I always think it's funny that my work email has these canned replies that you can use. I never want to use them, and it kind of annoys me that they pop up. Somebody will send you an email. I think Gmail does this too. And it gives you some options of canned replies like, that sounds great, or sure, let's do it. These stock replies that you could just click and respond to. Now, none works perfectly, right? They're all a little bit sort of generic, but the fact that you could just hit those buttons in some cases rather than forming your own email, maybe that changes the way that you think. Also with email, if we're expecting an instant response, if we're expecting more of a conversation rather than, say, a letter or another form of correspondence like a memo where you expect there to be more delay. Think about Zoom. Think about seeing yourself, your face on Zoom all the time. Does that change the way you communicate? I think it has to. Think about communicating or learning via Canvas, right? When your course is an asynchronous course, that might be very different than a course that's a synchronous course where you're looking at the screen in real time while your instructor is lecturing. And then think about just all of these other communications technologies that we use. There are constantly new ways of communicating. Do they change not only the style of our communication, but do they also change how we think about ourselves? Do they change even the content of what we're communicating? In other words, does the medium or the tool that we use, just like Nietzsche's typewriter, does it actually change how we think and maybe even change the content? Another example that I think is kind of interesting is one time I was driving in the car and I said, oh, scroll up to the person I was driving with. And the person said, scroll up? What do you mean scroll up? And I was like, scroll up. When what I really meant was pull forward. But I was so used to thinking of screens, right, and scrolling that was the language that I use. And I think there are so many other examples like that. Even when you go to save something, there's a 3.5 floppy disk icon, right, which is so kind of old school, but it sticks in our minds. So think about communications technologies. I'm sure you have some examples that I haven't even thought of. Explain the significance of Carr's discussion of clocks. So Carr references something really interesting about the clock and what it did to our conception of time. I'm going to start right here. Lewis Mumford, a cultural critic, described how the clock dissociated time from human events and helped create the belief in an independent world of mathematically measurable sequences. The abstract framework of divided time became a point of reference for both action and thought. The clock's methodical ticking helped bring about the scientific mind and the scientific man. But it also took something away. As the late MIT computer scientist Joseph Weizenbaum observed in his 1976 book, Computer Power and Human Reason from Judgment to Calculation, the concept of the world that emerged from the widespread use of timekeeping instruments, quote, remains an impoverished version of the older one, for it rests on a rejection of those direct experiences that form the basis for, and indeed constituted, the old reality. In deciding when to eat, to work, to sleep, to rise, we stopped listening to our senses and started obeying the clock. I think this is really compelling. So even though we might not think of the clock as this high-tech technology, right? It's a clock after all. The argument here is that the clock had a radically transformed how we viewed ourselves and when we started doing things. So on the one hand, at least according to this cultural critic, on the one hand, the clock made us more scientific, right? It categorized time into these discrete, easily measurable units, and you can see how that would lead to more scientific, more kind of objective thinking. But on the other hand, the clock became kind of like a ruler, right? The clock might dictate when to eat or when to wake up or when to do something. So on the one hand, having a clock makes it so that trains and airplanes can run on time, so that we can all be at the same time in the same place when we're having a meeting. But on the other hand, there's a way that the clock might have separated us from the natural rhythms of being a human. And think about it. How many of you will eat lunch at 12:30 just because it's lunchtime, right? Or wake up at a certain time even if you're exhausted just because it's wake up time? Or how many of you have like 30 alarms set on your phone as we speak? So think about this idea and think about how we could connect this clock example to Nicholas Carr's bigger argument about what the internet is doing to our brains. Let's talk a little bit about Taylorism. So Taylorism is very similar to this idea of the assembly line. So I'm asking you about Taylorism and why Carr is referencing it, but also whether or not efficiency is your ultimate goal. And this is something I think about a lot, and I think students think about a lot, because many of you are in school and trying to get your AA to then get your bachelor's degree as quickly as possible to get that great job. And I sympathize with that. I can absolutely understand that. A lot of you, though, are also in school because you want to really learn something or enjoy the process of learning or connect with your classmates or learn new things that aren't necessarily going to help you in a career. And many of you are probably doing both at the same time, right? Trying to manage both of those things. So think about this concept of efficiency and what you would give up to be more efficient. Maybe the answer is you wouldn't really give up anything to be more efficient. So let's talk about Taylorism just briefly. I'm going to start right here, and you can read the rest of this on your own. By breaking down every job into a sequence of small, discrete steps, and then testing different ways of performing each one, Taylor created a set of precise instructions, or an algorithm, we might say today, for how each worker should work. Midvale's employees grumbled about the strict new regime, claiming that it turned them into little more than automatons, but the factory's productivity soared. So we all know now from studying how cars are produced, or just kind of by thinking about it or by touring a factory, that when you have people do one step over and over again, but you perfect that one step, right? You come up with the best way of completing that one step or that one stage, you can get something built pretty quickly, right? Which means that all of us can go out and buy cheaper cars. And there are a lot of advantages to that, right? We can be much more efficient. Whereas if you have someone build the entire car, that's going to take a little bit longer, although it might require that the person who's creating that car uses higher order thinking, or uses critical thinking skills, or thinks about how all the parts will come together. So for the company, for the factory, it's great, right? Because you can get something done more quickly, you figure out the best way of doing something, and your workers do the same step over and over again. But you can also imagine for the worker, that might make you feel like an automaton, like a robot. In fact, if your job requires that you do the same step over and over again without much higher order thinking, then it might mean that you can be replaced by some sort of robot or by some sort of machine or by some sort of computer program. So the idea here is that it can be really efficient, but there might be some sort of cost to that efficiency. So I'd like you to think about this, especially as it relates to the internet and our learning. So what's your position on this statement? Nicholas Carr is very disturbed by this statement made by the founders of Google. That certainly, if you had all the world's information directly attached to your brain, you'd be better off. So he finds that disturbing. He finds that problematic. What do you think? Now, I would argue that we kind of do, right? It might not be plugged into my brain yet, but it's in my pocket all the time. It's often on my body or in my bag. If you think about it, your phone or your computer holds a very privileged position in your household, and you have access to pretty much everything that's ever been thought or said of importance, right? With Google. And yet you're still taking classes, right? You're not just in the University of Google. So there must be something that you're getting that you can't just get from Googling, or maybe you can just get it from Googling. So what do you think? If you had all the world's information attached to your brain, would you be better off? Do you think we're already there? What would be the point of going to school? What is the point of going to school when all the information you need is already out there for free, most of it on the internet? You might think about this concept of information overload, and I almost said overlord. And you might also think about what I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Nicholas Carr's figurative language, how he describes the internet as this thicket, right, where you have to go through foraging because there's just so much information. Number 9, discuss pancake people versus cathedral people. Do you agree or disagree with Foreman's comparison? So again, this is Nicholas Carr quoting Foreman. I'm going to just jump down to the really salient part right here. I come from a tradition of Western culture in which the ideal, my ideal, was the complex, dense, and cathedral-like structure of the highly educated and articulate personality. A man or woman who carried inside themselves a personally constructed and unique version of the entire heritage of the West. But now, I see within us all, myself included, the replacement of complex inner density with a new kind of self, evolving under the pressure of information overload and the technology of the instantly available. Wow. Okay, so the argument here is that we used to value cathedral people. And let's kind of think about what a cathedral is, why he would have used that symbol. A cathedral is something that often took a couple centuries to build. Oftentimes grandfathers and then fathers and then sons would work on the same cathedral. Oftentimes they'd be in the center of a city or a town. Think about cathedrals that maybe you visited or seen in pictures in Europe or in Latin America. So the center of the town, not just a spiritual life in the town, but really just the center of the town itself. You might also think about just the structure of a cathedral made with stone. Many cathedrals that were built 500 years ago still stand. Many people who aren't even religious, even if you're not Catholic or Anglican, when you heard the news that Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, that the part of the roof caught on fire, that might have touched you or made you feel sad or depressed. That's why people wept in the streets, even people who had never visited the cathedral, even people who weren't particularly religious. So the cathedral for a lot of people represents one of the highest achievements of mankind, or kind of like this reverent, beautiful space, but also something that's the center of the town, a center of culture, but something that's supposed to stand for hundreds of years, right? After all, it's made of stone or concrete and stained glass, right? When most of us enter a cathedral, we tend to kind of lower our voices and be reverent. On the other hand, unlike this intricate, grand cathedral that's also kind of intimidating too, at least in my opinion when I see a cathedral, A pancake is easily approachable. You can whip up pancakes in about 5 minutes. Everyone loves pancakes, right? But pancakes do not last hundreds of years. Pancakes don't take generations to build. While there might be a really great pancake place in the center of your town, they're not really the center of cultural and spiritual life. And also pancakes will disintegrate in a couple of minutes if left out. And they're sweet and kind of syrupy. So these pancake people, I think the most important thing is they're spread out flat, right? They're kind of flat, they're superficial, they're not complex and dense and intricate and something that can survive or pass the test of time like a cathedral. What do you think? Is technology turning us from cathedral people into pancake people? Is Nicholas Carr just being a Luddite here? Is he just sort of afraid of technology? Is he doing what a lot of people accuse older people of thinking that older people understood life or how to think or how to be complex, deep thinkers, and younger people are just superficial? Or do you think he has a point? What do you guys think here? Let's go to number 10. What counter arguments might you provide if you were asked to argue against Carr's thesis? So let's say hypothetically for your first essay test, I asked you to write an essay in which you agreed or disagreed, in this case disagreed with Carr's thesis. What are some counterpoints that you could make? I think Carr does a good job of planting some naysayers in his text and making some concessions. But what are some additional counter arguments that you could make? Do you consider, does texting affect writing? I know that essay is about texting rather than just Google in general, but I think there are some interesting counter arguments sort of implicit in that essay as well.